Today we pick up with our second lesson from the book of Joshua. We're following along this month in the Smyth and Helwys Formations series. This week our central question is, how much is up to me and how much is up to God? This comes on the heels of our lesson last week from the first chapter of Joshua, where we looked at how we are to face challenges that lie before us. We learned that God calls us to be courageously obedient in the face of challenges. Well, today we're going to be working in chapter 6 of Joshua and looking at the famous Battle of Jericho. You probably learned the song as a child. Joshua fought the Battle of Jericho and the walls came tumbling down. Well, let's review what has happened in the first 5 chapters of Joshua. Going back to chapter 1, Moses had just died, and now it was up to Joshua to lead the people into the promised land. This is not the first time that the people stood on the banks of the Jordan and considered making the crossing. God assures Joshua and the people that he has already given them the promised land. All they have to do is obediently possess it, take action to possess it. Well, in chapter 2, Moses sends spies across to scout out the enemy. The spies meet Rahab, who shows allegiance to God and God's people. Rahab also gives the spies an important piece of intelligence. She says that the people are fearful of Israel because of Israel's God. This further assures Joshua and the people of their success. In chapter 3, we have the famous crossing of the Jordan on dry ground. And then in chapter 4, the people select 12 stones to create a memorial to commemorate God's faithfulness. As we look at chapter 5, the generation that has grown up in the wilderness are uncircumcised. And so Joshua has the people circumcised. They also celebrate the Passover. And then we have Joshua in a vision meeting the commander of the army of the Lord, who reassures Joshua of his presence and the upcoming success. Well, that brings us to our focal text today, where we're going to take a look at the first 5 verses and then jump ahead to verses 20 through 25. So in verse 1 we have, now Jericho was shut up inside and out because of the Israelites. No one came out and no one went in. Jericho was an important part of taking possession of the promised land. Commentators say it was a military outpost that needed to be eliminated before proceeding. We know that the people in Jericho were afraid of the Israelites because of all they had heard about the God of the Israelites. So they were closed up tightly inside their fortress. In verse 2 we read, the Lord said to Joshua, see, I have handed Jericho over to you, along with its king and soldiers. You shall march around the city, all the warriors circling the city once. Thus you shall do for 6 days, with 7 priests bearing 7 trumpets of ram's horns before the ark. On the 7th day you shall march around the city 7 times, the priests blowing the trumpets. When they make a long blast with the ram's horn, as soon as you hear the sound of the trumpet, then all the people shall shout with a great shout, and the wall of the city will fall down flat, and all the people shall charge straight ahead. Well, I suspect Joshua was concerned about how to take such a fortified city. I mean, his army had been wandering around in the wilderness for 40 years. They lacked the necessary weapons of war needed to scale walls and break down gates. But God had a different plan. I can imagine Joshua telling his officers about this plan. Certainly somebody on his crew must have said, are you kidding me? Perhaps another one said, we're going to look awfully foolish to the enemy. Now let's jump to verses 20 to 25 and the events that occurred on that 7th day. So the people shouted and the trumpets were blown. As soon as the people heard the sound of the trumpets, they raised a great shout and the wall fell down flat. So the people charged straight ahead into the city and captured it. Then they devoted to destruction by the edge of the sword all in the city, both men and women, young and old, oxen, sheep, and donkeys. Well, what do you know? It actually worked, just as God said it would. And to Joshua's credit, his army followed the directions down to the smallest detail. Now, one of the questions that comes up is about God commanding Joshua to destroy everyone and everything in the city. We need to remember that the reason for this was that the people in Jericho represented temptation to God's people. They worshiped other gods and were culturally counter to what God wanted his people to be. Picking up in verse 22, Joshua said to the two men who had spied out the land, "Go into the prostitute's house and bring the woman out of it and all who belong to her, as you swore to her." So the young men who had been spies went in and brought Rahab out, along with her father, her mother, her brothers, and all who belonged to her. They brought all her kindred out and set them outside the camp of Israel. They burned down the city and everything in it. Only the silver and gold and vessels of bronze and iron they put into the treasury of the house of the Lord. But Rahab the prostitute, with her family and all who belonged to her, Joshua spared. Her family has lived in Israel ever since, for she hid the messengers who Joshua went who for she hid the messengers who Joshua sent to spy out Jericho. You know, as I read of Rahab, I get the sense that her story helps us make sense out of the mass destruction of Jericho. She turned to God, and God spared her by God's grace. The rest of the city did not. So, what takeaways in this story can we as modern day Christians find? Well, first, we all have a Jericho. Jericho represents the obstacles that will inevitably pop up when we choose to follow God. When Joshua chose to follow God, he was immediately confronted with challenges. Crossing the Jordan in Jericho seemed insurmountable. In fact, that's the point. Once we choose to follow God, we will continue to need to exercise our faith in the face of obstacles that are bigger than us. Second, we need to listen to God and understand what God's ways are through the obstacles. Just like they couldn't have crossed the Jordan without God's intervention, there is no way they could have defeated Jericho without God's help. Third, we are called to be obedient to God even when we don't understand everything. Joshua could much easier have understood a military strategy than he could the spiritual strategy that God wanted him to employ. If they had embarked on a military strategy, it would have been easy for them to take credit. Embarking on a spiritual strategy, however, God was glorified because it was obvious that the victory was due to God. Fourth, our God is just and he offers grace to all who turn to him. We are reminded in the example of Rahab that God uses broken people to accomplish his work, but we must first turn to God. So what are your Jerichos? What are the battles that are on the horizon for you that seem insurmountable? Health issues, relationship challenges, perhaps a career or financial struggle, or maybe some influence in your life that keeps you from experiencing all of the joy that God promises. And what is your prayer? God was not Joshua's co-pilot. Joshua was God's servant. The promised land wasn't the goal of human minds. Rather, it was the gift of a gracious God. We can be assured that our God has a plan for our lives and that if we will listen to him, we will come to understand how best to serve him. We can also count on obstacles along the way. Just like with the people of Israel, God strengthens our faith as we obediently listen to him and follow his plans for our life. Finally, going back to our central question, which was how much is up to me and how much is up to God? I believe it takes both faith and action. God will deliver the victory if we choose to be obedient and act in faith. Well, I hope you find some answers and some direction in the scripture text that we studied today. Join me next week when we look at the 10th chapter of Joshua and seek to answer the question, what do I have the right to ask of God? Until then, I hope you have a great week. God bless you, and we'll see you again next time.